Imagine being handed a prenup at your wedding altar and called a gold digger in front of everyone. That's what happened to Anoush Petrosian. But her calculated response? A devastating twist that shifted power in an instant, leaving jaws dropped and legacies shattered. Thanks for having me, Eliza. Sharing this has been cathartic. It's all about turning pain into power. I'm ready to dive in and show how patience and smarts can flip the script on disrespect. I should have known something was wrong when Davies called me exotic at our first family dinner. I was 28 then, my jet black hair pulled back in a sleek bun, wearing a conservative navy dress that my Armenian grandmother would have approved of. My dark brown eyes met his across the mahogany table as he raised his wine glass and proclaimed, "To Mark's exotic little find." Mark squeezed my hand under the table and whispered an apology, but I could see the flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. His mother, Eliza, tittered nervously and changed the subject to the weather. That should have been my first red flag, but I was in love, or at least I thought I was. My name is Anoush Petrosian, and at 29, I had built something my immigrant grandparents could never have imagined. While they had arrived in America with nothing but determination and the clothes on their backs, I had parlayed my MBA from Wharton into a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring underperforming family businesses. Petrosian Capital wasn't just successful, it was ruthless when it needed to be. Born and raised in Boston, I was as American as apple pie, but my Armenian heritage ran through my veins like molten gold, giving me strength and wisdom passed down through generations of survivors. But sitting in that dining room, watching Mark's family treat me like an interesting museum piece, I felt like that scared little girl again, the one who had been mocked for bringing dolma to school lunch instead of sandwiches. I wanted so desperately to belong somewhere that I was willing to overlook their casual condescension. Mark and I had met at a charity gala 18 months earlier. He was handsome in that effortless way that comes from generations of good breeding, sandy brown hair that always looked perfectly tousled, blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and a confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. He worked for his father's company, Davies and Son Logistics, though worked was a generous term for what amounted to showing up to board meetings and networking events. What drew me to him initially was his apparent gentleness. Unlike the aggressive alpha males I usually encountered in business, Mark seemed content to let others take the lead. He listened when I talked about my work, asked thoughtful questions about my Armenian heritage, and never once made me feel like I was too much or too ambitious. "You're going to love my family," he had said after we'd been dating for 6 months. "They're going to adore you." But adoration never came. Instead, I got tolerance wrapped in passive aggression. Eliza would compliment my interesting fashion choices while fingering her own pearl necklace. Gregory would ask pointed questions about my little business while discussing Davies and Son's legacy. And Mark's younger sister, Caroline, would make comments about how refreshing it was that Mark was dating someone so different. The engagement had been a fairy tale, at least on the surface. Mark proposed at the same charity gala where we'd met, getting down on one knee in front of 500 of Boston's elite. The ring was a stunning 3-carat diamond that had belonged to his grandmother, and when he slipped it onto my finger, I felt like Cinderella finally getting her prince. But even then, the family's true feelings leaked through. During the engagement party planning, Eliza insisted on hiring their caterer, their florist, and their wedding planner. When I suggested incorporating some Armenian traditions, perhaps a Kochkar blessing ceremony or traditional Armenian music during the reception, she smiled tightly and said, "How lovely, dear, but we want to keep things elegant and understated." The implication was clear. My heritage was neither elegant nor understated. The guest list became another battleground. My family was large and boisterous, aunts and uncles and cousins who would dance until dawn and tell stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. The Davies family preferred intimate gatherings where conversations stayed safely within the bounds of weather, travel, and mutual acquaintances' accomplishments. "Maybe we could limit your side to immediate family," Eliza suggested during one particularly tense planning session. "The venue has capacity constraints." I bit my tongue and agreed, watching my guest list shrink from 80 to 23, while theirs remained a robust 150. The venue costs alone were staggering: $150,000 for the Ashford estate, mostly covered by the Davies family's insistence on maintaining standards. Every decision felt like a small death, each compromise another piece of my identity sacrificed on the altar of their approval. My grandmother had been so excited about seeing Armenian customs honored at my wedding, about sharing our traditions with a new family. Instead, those dreams were systematically dismantled in favor of their vision of propriety. The breaking point should have come during the rehearsal dinner. Gregory stood up to give a toast, his face flushed with expensive wine and self-importance. He raised his glass and looked directly at me, his gray eyes cold despite his smile. "To Mark," he began, "for following his heart, even when it leads him down unexpected paths, and to Anoush for recognizing a good opportunity when she sees one." The words hit me like a slap. Around the table, the Davies family chuckled appreciatively while my own family sat in stunned silence. My father's jaw tightened, and I saw my mother reach for his hand to keep him from standing up. I felt the heat of humiliation creep up my neck, my dark brown eyes burning with unshed tears of rage. Mark leaned over and whispered, "He doesn't mean anything by it, Anoush. He's just nervous about losing me." But I knew better. Gregory Davies meant exactly what he'd said. In his mind, I was a gold digger who had successfully identified and targeted his son. The fact that my net worth was actually higher than Mark's was irrelevant. I was the outsider, the exotic interloper who had somehow managed to infiltrate their perfect American dynasty. That night, alone in my hotel room, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to Zara Akafer, my assistant and the closest thing I had to a strategic partner. "Zara," I wrote, "I need you to activate the Davies acquisition plan. Full execution. Timeline before the wedding. I'll send the signal tomorrow." You see, what the Davies family didn't know was that I had been watching their company for months before I'd ever met Mark. Davies & Son Logistics was exactly the kind of target Petrosian capital, specialized in a family business that had grown complacent, relying on legacy relationships rather than innovation. Their profit margins were declining, they were over-leveraged, and Gregory's ego had led him to make several questionable expansion decisions. I had initially planned to approach them professionally, but then I'd met Mark and genuinely fallen for him. I'd shelved the acquisition plans, thinking that love and business shouldn't mix. But after 18 months of subtle insults and barely concealed contempt, I realized that the Davies family had made this personal long before I'd decided to make it business. While planning my wedding, I was simultaneously planning something else entirely. Zara had been my right hand since I'd started Petrosian Capital, a brilliant Nigerian-American woman who could dissect a company's financials the way a surgeon dissected a human body. She was also discreet, efficient, and shared my appreciation for poetic justice. "Tell me everything," I had said to her the morning after the rehearsal dinner. We met in my office, a sleek space on the 32nd floor of a downtown Boston high-rise. The walls were lined with awards and photographs of successful acquisitions, but my favorite piece was a small framed quote from my grandmother. "Patience is the Armenian woman's greatest weapon." Zara spread the Davies & Son files across my conference table like a general planning a military campaign. "It's worse than we initially thought," she said, her British accent making even bad news sound elegant. "Gregory's expansion into the West Coast market has been a disaster. They're hemorrhaging money, and he's been using the company's real estate as collateral for increasingly risky loans." She pulled up a spreadsheet on her tablet. "The family home, mortgaged against company debt. The Ashford estate where you're getting married, they don't own it outright anymore. They've been using it as collateral for operating loans. Gregory's been essentially gambling with the family legacy, and he's losing." I studied the numbers, feeling a familiar thrill that came with spotting opportunity in chaos. "What about their stock structure?" "Here's where it gets interesting," Zara said, pulling up another document. Davies & Son went public briefly in the 1990s to raise capital, but then Gregory bought back most of the shares to maintain family control. However, he never acquired all of them. There are still minority shareholders scattered around, former employees who were given stock options, a few small investment firms that held onto their positions. She leaned forward, her dark eyes gleaming. "I've been quietly reaching out to these minority shareholders over the past 6 months. Most of them are frustrated with the company's performance and Gregory's leadership. They're ready to sell. How much would we need for a controlling interest?" 51%. Based on current market conditions and the company's declining value, I estimate we could acquire controlling interest for approximately $42 million. I did the math in my head. It was a significant investment, but not beyond Petrosian Capital's capabilities. And given Davies and Sons' underlying assets, their real estate holdings, their established client relationships, their logistics network, it was actually undervalued. My extensive resources and established network of shell companies would allow us to move with unprecedented speed, something that would have been impossible for a smaller firm. What's the timeline? If we move quickly and quietly, I can have the paperwork completed within 3 weeks. The beauty is that Massachusetts corporate law doesn't require disclosure of beneficial ownership until after the acquisition is complete. Gregory won't know what's happening until it's too late. I walked to the window, looking out over Boston Harbor. In the distance, I could see the neighborhood where my grandparents had first settled, where they had worked 16-hour days in a textile factory to build a life for their children. They had taught me that respect was earned, not inherited, and that dignity was something that could never be taken away. The Davies family had spent 18 months trying to strip away my dignity, treating me like a charity case who should be grateful for their tolerance. They were about to learn that underestimating an Armenian woman was a very expensive mistake. "Do it," I said, turning back to Zara, "but I want complete discretion. Shell companies, intermediary firms, whatever it takes, and I want the acquisition to close the day before the wedding." Zara smiled, the expression of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. "Consider it done." The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in corporate stealth. While I attended dress fittings and cake tastings, Zara orchestrated one of the most elegant hostile takeovers in Boston business history. She started with the easy targets, the former employees who held small stock positions and had grown bitter watching Gregory run the company into the ground. A retired logistics manager who had been forced into early retirement sold his 2.3% stake immediately. A former VP who had been pushed out after questioning Gregory's West Coast expansion was happy to part with his 4.1% for cash. The institutional investors were more challenging, but ultimately more rewarding. A pension fund that had held Davies and Son stock for 15 years was concerned about the company's declining dividends. When Zara approached them through an intermediary with an offer that was 20% above market value, they didn't hesitate. The most delicate negotiation involved Margaret Davies-Chen, Gregory's estranged cousin who had inherited her father's 8.7% stake. She had been feuding with Gregory for years over his refusal to modernize the company's technology infrastructure. "She wants to meet with you personally," Zara told me during one of our weekly updates. "She's suspicious about who's behind the acquisition." I agreed to the meeting, which took place in a private dining room at the Four Seasons. Margaret was a sharp woman in her 60s, with Gregory's same patrician features but none of his arrogance. "You're Mark's fiancé," she said, studying me over her wine glass. "This is quite a coincidence." "I prefer to think of it as synergy," I replied. "You want Gregory held accountable for his mismanagement. I want to restore Davies and Son to profitability. Our interests align." Margaret laughed, a sound that held decades of family frustration. "Gregory always did underestimate women. My father warned him about that." She leaned forward. "What exactly are you planning?" I told her the truth, that I intended to restructure the company, bring in professional management, and focus on sustainable growth rather than ego-driven expansion. I also told her about the 18 months of subtle humiliation I had endured from her family. "They called you a gold digger, didn't they?" Margaret asked. "Among other things." She signed the paperwork that afternoon. By the Thursday before my Saturday wedding, Petrosian Capital owned 52.3% of Davies and Son Logistics. The acquisition had been structured through a complex web of shell companies and investment vehicles that would take Gregory's lawyers weeks to unravel. By then, it would be far too late. But I wasn't finished. The Ashford estate, where my wedding was scheduled to take place, had been mortgaged to secure a loan that Davies and Son had defaulted on 3 months earlier. The bank was preparing to foreclose, which would have ruined not just my wedding, but several other events scheduled for the coming months. "The bank is willing to sell the note for 60 cents on the dollar," Zara informed me on Friday morning. "They want to avoid the publicity of foreclosing on a historic property." "Buy it," I said. "And make sure the paperwork is processed before tomorrow morning."
That evening, at the rehearsal, I watched Gregory pontificate about family legacy and tradition, completely unaware that his empire was already crumbling. Mark stood beside me, handsome and oblivious, still believing that his father's money would protect him from any real consequences. I squeezed his hand and smiled, thinking about my grandmother's favorite Armenian proverb: "The dog barks, but the caravan moves on." Tomorrow, the caravan would reach its destination. I woke up on my wedding day feeling calmer than I had in months. The morning sun streamed through the windows of my bridal suite at the Four Seasons, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't anxious about the Davies family's latest slight or subtle insult. My hairstylist had arrived early to create the sleek, straight style I'd requested, my jet black hair falling like a curtain down my back, elegant and severe. My makeup artist enhanced my dark brown eyes with subtle smoky shadows that made them look almost mysterious. When I looked in the mirror, I saw my grandmother's strength reflected back at me. My mother, Anahit, bustled around the suite, adjusting flowers and fussing over details. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that never stopped moving, a legacy of her own mother's nervous energy. "You look beautiful, Aziz," she said, using the Armenian endearment that meant dear one. "But are you sure about this, about him?" My mother had never warmed to Mark, though she'd been too polite to say so directly. Armenian mothers have a sixth sense about these things, and she'd picked up on the family's condescension long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it. "I'm sure about what I'm doing, Mama," I said, which wasn't quite the same thing but seemed to satisfy her. My phone buzzed with a text from Zara: "All packages delivered. Waiting for your signal." The packages were the legal documents that would change everything. Termination notices, eviction papers, and most importantly, the official notification of the change in corporate ownership that would be filed with the Massachusetts Secretary of State at exactly 11 a.m., 30 minutes into what should have been my wedding ceremony. I slipped into my dress, a stunning creation of French lace and silk that had cost more than most people's cars. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was wearing a fortune while planning to destroy the family that had called me a gold digger. The drive to the Ashford estate felt surreal. The property was magnificent, a sprawling Georgian mansion set on 50 acres of manicured grounds. As our car wound up the circular drive, I could see the pavilion where the ceremony would take place, decorated with white roses and peonies that probably cost more than my grandmother's first apartment. What the Davies family didn't know was that, as of 9 a.m. that morning, I owned this place. In the bridal preparation room, Eleanor Davies fluttered around like an anxious bird, adjusting my veil and offering unsolicited advice about everything from my posture to my smile. She was dressed in pale blue silk that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her jewelry understated but undoubtedly expensive. "Now remember, dear," she said, "the Davies family has certain traditions. During the ceremony, you'll want to look appropriately grateful when Father Davies speaks about welcoming you into the family." I nodded and smiled, thinking about how appropriate my gratitude was about to be. Caroline, Mark's sister, was serving as my maid of honor, a decision I'd regretted almost immediately. She was a younger, prettier version of her mother, with the same casual cruelty wrapped in social niceties. "I just think it's so wonderful," she said while adjusting my train, "how you've managed to fit in so well despite being so different." "Different how?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "Oh, you know," she waved her hand vaguely, "your background and all." It must have been quite an adjustment, learning our ways, as if kindness and respect were foreign concepts that required a special cultural education. Through the window, I could see the guests taking their seats. The Davies side was a sea of navy suits and pastel dresses, old money dressed down to appear modest while still signaling their status through subtle details: the right watch, the perfect handbag, shoes that cost more than most people's rent. My side was smaller but warmer. My aunts and uncles and cousins wore their best clothes with obvious pride, the kind of people who had worked for everything they owned and weren't ashamed to show it. My father, Aram, looked distinguished in his black suit, his thick mustache neatly trimmed, his dark eyes scanning the Davies family with barely concealed suspicion. At exactly 10:30, the wedding coordinator knocked on the door. "It's time, Miss Petrosian." I took one last look in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was beautiful, poised, and absolutely ready for war. The processional music began, and I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, my jet black hair catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the pavilion's open sides. Every step felt deliberate, purposeful. I wasn't walking toward my future husband, I was walking toward my destiny. Mark stood at the altar looking nervous but handsome in his black tuxedo. His best man, his college roommate James, gave me an encouraging smile. The officiant, an elderly minister who had performed Davies' family ceremonies for 3 generations, beamed at me with grandfatherly warmth. But my eyes were drawn to Gregory Davies in the front row. He sat with the posture of a man who owned everything around him, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating the quiet confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged. Eliza sat beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the emotional mother-in-law. The ceremony began with the traditional words, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Mark Gregory Davies and Anoush Petrosian." I barely heard the opening remarks. My attention was focused on the back of the pavilion, where I could see Zara standing near the entrance. She was dressed in a sharp black suit, looking every inch the corporate attorney she had trained to be before joining my firm. In her hands was a leather portfolio that contained enough legal documents to end the Davies family's reign over their little empire. The minister was midway through his remarks about the sacred nature of marriage when Gregory Davies suddenly stood up. "Excuse me, Reverend," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm afraid we need to pause for a moment." A murmur went through the assembled guests. Mark's face went pale, and I saw him shoot a panicked look at his father. This wasn't part of the program. Gregory stepped into the aisle and walked toward the altar with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. In his hand was a thick manila envelope. "Before we proceed," he announced, his voice loud enough for every guest to hear, "there's a small matter of business that needs to be addressed." He handed the envelope to Mark, who took it with trembling hands. I could see the sweat beating on my fiancé's forehead as he realized what his father was doing. "What is this?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. Gregory's smile was cold and triumphant. "A prenuptial agreement. A formality, really, but one that protects the Davies family interests." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I heard my mother gasp behind me, and I could feel the collective shock of our guests. A prenup presented at the altar wasn't just insulting, it was deliberately humiliating. "I don't understand," I said, playing the role of the confused bride while my dark brown eyes blazed with carefully controlled fury. "Why wasn't this discussed before today?" Eliza Davies spoke up from her seat, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh dear, I thought Mark had mentioned it. It's just a standard protection for the family business. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." The woman had just publicly branded me as a potential threat to their financial security, and she was calling it nothing personal. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me, watching this public degradation unfold. My grandmother sat in the third row, her weathered hands clenched in her lap, her face a mask of barely contained rage. My father's jaw was so tight I thought it might snap. Gregory's voice cut through the uncomfortable silence like a blade. "Sign it or the wedding's off, gold digger." The words hit like a physical blow, echoing through the pavilion's perfect acoustics. "Gold digger," said loud enough for every single guest to hear, including my elderly grandmother who had flown in from California, including my father who had worked 2 jobs to put me through college, including my cousins and aunts and uncles who had scraped together money for new clothes and plane tickets to celebrate what they thought was my happiness. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the humiliation burning in my cheeks. This was the moment Gregory had been building toward for 18 months, the public demonstration of my place in their hierarchy, the final proof that I was nothing more than a fortune hunter who should be grateful for their tolerance. I looked at Mark, hoping against hope that he would defend me, that he would tell his father to sit down and apologize. Instead, he stood there holding the prenup like it might explode, his face a mask of cowardice and shame. The pavilion was dead silent. 200 guests held their breath, waiting to see if I would sign away my dignity or call off the wedding and walk away in humiliation. I looked down at the prenup, then back up at Gregory Davies. His gray eyes were cold and satisfied, the look of a man who had just played what he thought was his winning card. That's when I smiled. I reached for the ornate fountain pen that the officiant kept on his podium for signing the marriage certificate. The pen felt heavy in my hand, substantial, like the weight of justice itself. "You're absolutely right, Gregory," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the pavilion's perfect acoustics. "Legal protections are very important in a marriage." I signed the prenup with a flourish, my signature bold and confident across the bottom of the page. Gregory's smile widened, and I saw Elena actually clap her hands together in delight. "Wonderful," Gregory said. "Now we can proceed with—" "Actually," I interrupted, handing the pen back to the officiant, "before we continue, I have a few announcements of my own to make." I turned to face our guests, my jet-black hair catching the afternoon light, my dark brown eyes scanning the crowd with the confidence of someone who had just played the ultimate trump card. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady and clear, "I want to thank you all for being here today to witness what is indeed a very important union. Not the union of two hearts, as it turns out, but the union of business interests." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Gregory's smile was beginning to falter, uncertainty creeping into his gray eyes. "You see," I continued, "Gregory is absolutely right that legal protections are crucial, which is why I've spent the last 3 weeks ensuring that I have all the legal protection I need." I nodded toward the back of the pavilion, where Zara had been waiting for my signal. She stepped forward with the grace of a dancer and the purpose of an executioner, her black suit a stark contrast to the sea of wedding pastels around her. "As of 9 a.m. this morning," I announced, my voice growing stronger with each word, "Petrosian Capital has acquired a controlling interest in Davies & Son Logistics, 52.3% to be exact." The words landed like a bomb. Gregory's face went from confident pink to alarmed white in the space of a heartbeat. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth. Mark dropped the prenup, the papers scattering at his feet like fallen leaves. "Furthermore," I continued, "as the new majority owner of Davies & Son Logistics, I am implementing immediate changes to the company's leadership structure." Zara had reached the front of the pavilion now, moving with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She opened her leather portfolio and withdrew the first of several official documents. "Gregory Davies," I said, looking directly at the man who had called me a gold digger 30 seconds earlier, "you are hereby terminated from your position as CEO of Davies & Son Logistics, effective immediately." Zara handed him the termination letter with the same professional courtesy she might use to deliver a birthday card. Gregory took it with shaking hands, his face now a mottled gray that suggested he might be having some kind of medical episode. "Elena Davies," I continued, turning to my almost mother-in-law, "as the company's director of public relations, your services are also no longer required." Another envelope, another termination letter. Elena stared at it as if it were written in a foreign language. "And Mark," I said, finally turning to the man I had been about to marry, "your position as vice president of operations has also been eliminated." The third envelope seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds in Mark's hands. He looked up at me with the expression of someone who had just realized he was standing in quicksand. But I wasn't finished. My voice took on the tone I used in boardroom negotiations as I delivered the final blow. "Now," I said, my voice taking on the tone I used in boardroom negotiations, "regarding your living situation. As you may not be aware, your family home has been mortgaged against company assets to secure loans that are currently in default." I could see my father in the crowd now, his face showing the first glimmer of understanding and what might have been pride. My mother was staring at me with her mouth open, probably wondering where her quiet daughter had gone. "Additionally," I continued, "the Ashford estate, where we are currently gathered, was also used as collateral for company debt. As of this morning, I am the new owner of this property." The gasps from the crowd were audible now. Some guests were pulling out their phones, recording what would undoubtedly become the most viral wedding video in social media history. Zara handed me the final envelope, thicker than the others, bound with an official seal. "These," I said, holding up the envelope for everyone to see, "are your eviction notices. You have 30 days to vacate both the company headquarters and your family residence." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear birds singing in the trees beyond the pavilion. 200 guests sat in absolute stunned silence, witnessing the most spectacular reversal of fortune in Boston social history. Gregory Davies, the man who had humiliated me in front of everyone I loved, was now standing at my wedding holding his own professional death warrant. The family that had spent 18 months treating me like a charity case had just discovered that they were now financially dependent on my mercy. I walked over to Mark and gently took his hand, removing my grandmother's engagement ring from my finger. "The wedding is off," I said softly, but loud enough for the front rows to hear. "I'm afraid I can't marry someone whose family thinks so little of me, and frankly, I deserve better than a man who would let his father humiliate me at our own wedding." I placed the ring in Mark's palm and closed his fingers around it. "Keep it," I said. "You're going to need every asset you can get." I turned away from the altar and began walking back down the aisle, my wedding dress trailing behind me like a victory banner. The guests parted before me like the Red Sea, their faces showing everything from shock to admiration to barely concealed glee. The satisfaction coursing through my veins was intoxicating. This was what justice felt like, pure and undiluted. Halfway down the aisle, I paused next to my grandmother, Surin, who was sitting in the third row with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She reached out and grabbed my hand, pulling me down so she could whisper in my ear. "Bravo, Aziz," she said in Armenian. "Your grandfather would be so proud." I kissed her cheek and continued walking, feeling lighter with every step. Behind me, I could hear the chaos beginning to unfold. Voices raised in confusion, the scraping of chairs as people stood up, the general murmur of 200 people trying to process what they had just witnessed. As I reached the back of the pavilion, I turned for one last look at the scene I was leaving behind. Gregory Davies was still standing at the altar, clutching his termination letter, his face the color of old parchment. Eleanor had sunk into her chair and was being fanned by Caroline, who looked like she might faint herself. Mark stood alone at the altar, still holding my engagement ring, looking like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. The minister, bless him, was trying to restore some semblance of order. "Perhaps," he suggested hopefully, "we should adjourn for now and reconvene when everyone has had a chance to process these developments." I almost laughed. There would be no reconvening. The Davies family dynasty had just come to an abrupt end, and I was the one who had delivered the final blow. Outside the pavilion, Zara was waiting with my car. She had changed into casual clothes and looked like she was trying very hard not to smile. "How do you feel?" she asked as I gathered up my train and slid into the passenger seat. "Free," I said, and meant it. As we drove away from the Ashford estate, my estate now, I could see guests streaming out of the pavilion. Some were heading to their cars, probably eager to escape the awkwardness. Others were clustering in small groups, no doubt dissecting what they had just witnessed. A few were taking pictures with their phones, capturing the moment for social media posterity. By tomorrow, the story would be all over Boston. By next week, it would probably make the national business news. Armenian entrepreneur destroys former fiancé's family empire at wedding altar had a nice ring to it. "What's next?" Zara asked as we pulled onto the main road. "Next, we rebuild Davies and Son into something actually worth owning," I said, "and then we make sure this story gets told properly." I pulled out my phone and started typing a text to my cousin Ani, who worked as a journalist for the Boston Globe's business section. "I have a story for you," I wrote. "And you're going to want to get an exclusive interview." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of media attention, legal maneuvering, and corporate restructuring. The story of my wedding day revenge became a sensation, spawning countless articles, blog posts, and social media discussions about everything from prenuptial agreements to corporate governance to the treatment of immigrant families by old money Boston society. The business media was particularly fascinated by the mechanics of the acquisition. Forbes ran a detailed analysis of how I had managed to acquire a controlling stake in Davies and Son without triggering disclosure requirements. Harvard Business School requested an interview for a case study on hostile takeovers. The Wall Street Journal dubbed it the Wedding Day Massacre in a headline that I secretly loved. But the real satisfaction came from the transformation of the company itself. Davies and Son Logistics had been hemorrhaging money under Gregory's leadership, bloated with unnecessary executives and hampered by outdated technology. Within a month of taking control, I had streamlined operations, invested in new logistics software, and renegotiated several key contracts that Gregory's ego had prevented him from approaching properly. The company's stock price, which had been in steady decline for 3 years, jumped 40% in the first quarter under new management. Employee morale improved dramatically once the culture of nepotism and entitlement was replaced with merit-based advancement and competitive compensation. Margaret Davies, Gregory's cousin who had sold me her shares, joined the new board of directors and proved to be an invaluable ally. She had been pushing for modernization for years and was thrilled to finally see her ideas implemented. "You know," she told me during one of our quarterly board meetings, "my father always said that Gregory would be the downfall of this company. He just never imagined it would happen quite so dramatically." The Davies family, meanwhile, had largely disappeared from Boston society. Gregory found work as a consultant for a mid-sized logistics firm in Hartford, a significant step down from his former position. Eliza joined a few charity boards but kept a much lower profile than she had as the wife of a CEO. Caroline moved to New York, where she was reportedly working in art gallery management. Mark was the most interesting case. After the initial shock wore off, he actually reached out to me through his lawyer, not to contest the acquisition, which would have been futile anyway, but to apologize. "I know it doesn't matter now," he wrote in a letter that arrived 3 months after the wedding, "but I want you to know that I'm ashamed of how my family treated you, and I'm ashamed that I didn't stand up for you when I should have." The letter went on for several pages, detailing his recognition of his family's prejudice and his own cowardice. He was in therapy, he wrote, trying to understand how he had been raised to see people like me as somehow lesser despite all evidence to the contrary. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter concluded, "but I wanted you to know that you were right about everything. You deserved so much better than what we gave you." I never responded to the letter, but I kept it. Not out of any lingering affection, but as a reminder of how easy it is for good people to become complicit in cruelty when they don't have the courage to stand up for what's right. A year after the wedding that never was, I stood in the corner office that had once belonged to Gregory Davies, looking out over Boston Harbor. The office had been completely redecorated. Gone were the hunting prints and leather-bound books that were never read, replaced with modern art and actual business publications. On my desk was a framed photo of my grandparents on their wedding day in 1952, 2 young Armenian immigrants who had believed that America was a place where hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Next to it was a copy of Forbes magazine with my picture on the cover, under the headline, "The Armenian Avenger: How Anoush Petrosian Built an Empire on the Ashes of Old Money." Davies and Son Logistics, now Petrosian Logistics, had become one of the fastest-growing companies in New England. We had expanded into new markets, developed innovative supply chain solutions, and attracted top talent from across the industry. The company that had been slowly dying under Gregory's leadership was now thriving under mine. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was walking into Boston's most exclusive restaurants and seeing the same people who had once looked down on me now greeting me with genuine respect. It was watching my parents beam with pride as they read articles about their daughter's success. It was knowing that my grandmother's faith in the American dream had been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. The Armenian community in Boston had embraced me as a symbol of what was possible when you refused to accept other people's limitations on your worth. I had established a scholarship fund for Armenian American students pursuing business degrees, and I regularly spoke at community events about entrepreneurship and self-determination. "You showed them that we're not to be underestimated," my cousin Ani told me at a family gathering. "Every Armenian girl in Boston knows your story now. They know they don't have to accept being treated as less than." That, more than any business success, felt like the real achievement. As I write this story now, 3 years after that wedding day, I'm often asked if I regret how everything unfolded. People want to know if I feel guilty about destroying a family's legacy, if I wish I had handled things differently, if I ever think about what might have been. The answer is no, I don't regret it. Not for a single moment. The Davies family's downfall wasn't the result of my vindictiveness. It was the inevitable consequence of their own arrogance and prejudice. They created the conditions for their own destruction by treating people as disposable, by believing that their money and status made them untouchable, by failing to recognize that the world had changed around them. I simply gave them the rope they needed to hang themselves. What I did that day at the altar wasn't revenge, it was justice. There's a difference. Revenge is emotional, impulsive, destructive. Justice is calculated, proportional, and ultimately constructive. I didn't destroy the Davies family to make myself feel better. I removed them from positions of power they had proven unworthy to hold. The company is stronger now. The employees are better treated. The business is more profitable and more ethical. The only people who suffered were those who had been causing suffering for others. Sometimes, I think about the moment when Gregory called me a gold digger in front of 200 people. In his mind, he was putting me in my place, reminding everyone present of the natural hierarchy that he believed should govern all social interactions. He was the wealthy American patriarch, and I was the foreign interloper who needed to be reminded of her station. What he failed to understand was that I had never been seeking his approval or acceptance. I had been evaluating him, and he had failed the test spectacularly. The prenup he forced me to sign that day became worthless the moment I signed it, because it was based on the assumption that I was marrying into wealth rather than the reality that I already possessed more assets than the entire Davies family combined. It was a document written by people who had fundamentally misunderstood the situation they were in. In the end, Gregory Davies taught me something valuable, that some people will never respect you until you force them to. They will mistake kindness for weakness, patience for passivity, and grace for desperation. When you encounter such people, the only language they understand is power. So I spoke to them in their native tongue. My grandmother used to tell me stories about our family's journey to America, about the hardships they endured and the strength they found in each other. We survive, she would say, not because we are lucky, but because we are smart. We watch, we learn, we adapt, and when the time comes, we act. That wisdom, passed down through generations of Armenian women who had faced far greater challenges than a snobbish Boston family, guided me through those 18 months of subtle humiliation and that final moment of public confrontation. The Davies family saw my patience as evidence of my gratitude, my quiet observation as proof of my inferiority. They never considered that I might be studying them, learning their weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to demonstrate that their assumptions about me were not just wrong, but catastrophically so. In Armenian culture, we have a concept called elk, nous, kelk, which roughly translates to wisdom, but encompasses something deeper, the ability to see situations clearly, to understand human nature, and to act with both intelligence and integrity. It's the quality that allowed my grandparents to build a life in a foreign country, that helped my parents raise successful children despite facing discrimination, and that gave me the tools to turn the Davies family's prejudice against them. When people ask me how I was able to orchestrate such a complex acquisition while planning a wedding, I tell them it's because Armenian women are taught from birth to be strategic thinkers. We learn early that survival often depends on being 3 steps ahead of those who would underestimate us. The wedding day itself was just the culmination of months of careful planning. Every document had been prepared, every legal requirement had been met, every contingency had been considered. By the time Gregory handed me that prenup, the battle was already over. He just didn't know it yet. That's the Armenian way. Let your enemies think they're winning right up until the moment they discover they've already lost. Today, as I sit in my office overlooking the harbor where my great-grandparents first set foot in America, I think about the journey that brought me here. From that first uncomfortable family dinner, where Gregory called me exotic, to the moment I signed my name on his termination letter, every step was part of a larger story about respect, dignity, and the price of underestimating people based on their background. The Ashford estate, where my wedding was supposed to take place, has been transformed into a conference center and event space that hosts business retreats and corporate functions. It's profitable, well-managed, and serves a purpose beyond just displaying wealth. Sometimes I walk through the grounds and remember that day, the feeling of walking down that aisle knowing that I was about to change everything. The pavilion where Gregory humiliated me is now used for corporate award ceremonies and product launches. The irony isn't lost on me that the place where he tried to put me in my place has become a symbol of business achievement and innovation. Petrosian Logistics continues to grow, expanding into new markets and developing cutting-edge solutions for supply chain challenges. We employ over 800 people now, with offices in 6 states and plans for international expansion. The company that was slowly dying under Gregory's leadership has become a model for how family businesses can evolve and thrive in the modern economy. But perhaps the most satisfying development has been watching other young women, particularly those from immigrant families, draw inspiration from my story. I receive letters and emails regularly from women who tell me that my example gave them the courage to demand better treatment, to refuse to accept disrespect, to fight for what they deserve. "You showed us that we don't have to be grateful for scraps," one young woman wrote to me. "You showed us that we can own the whole table." That's the legacy I want to leave, not just a successful business, but a demonstration that respect is not something you ask for, it's something you command. The Davies family, meanwhile, has largely faded from public view. Gregory's consulting work keeps him employed, but hardly prosperous. Eliza has scaled back her social activities considerably. Mark, according to mutual acquaintances, has actually done some genuine soul-searching and is reportedly in a healthy relationship with a woman who challenges him to be better than his upbringing taught him to be. I wish them no ill will. Their punishment was losing the power they had abused, not suffering for its own sake. Justice, real justice, is about restoration and prevention, not destruction. As for me, I'm exactly where I belong, in control of my own destiny, surrounded by people who respect my abilities rather than tolerate my presence, building something meaningful rather than just inheriting something unearned. Every morning when I walk into my office, I pass a small plaque that my father had made for me. It's engraved with a quote from my grandmother: "A woman who knows her worth doesn't need anyone else's permission to claim it." Gregory Davies thought he could hand me a prenup and force me to accept his family's valuation of my worth. Instead, I handed him a termination letter and showed him exactly how much his family was worth to me. The difference between those two documents tells the whole story. One was based on fear, prejudice, and the desperate need to maintain an illusion of superiority. The other was based on merit, preparation, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've earned everything you have. In the end, that made all the difference. 3 years later, I did get married to David Nazarian, a brilliant cardiologist whose Armenian-American family understood both the importance of tradition and the value of genuine partnership. Our wedding was held at the Ashford estate, in the same pavilion where I had once been humiliated, but this time surrounded only by people who loved and respected both of us. My grandmother, now 92 and still sharp as a tack, gave a toast that brought tears to every eye in the house. "In Armenia," she said, "we have a saying, 'The tree that bends in the storm survives, but the tree that stands firm grows stronger.'" My granddaughter chose to stand firm, and look how strong she has grown. And as we danced our first dance as husband and wife, my jet black hair catching the light from the chandeliers, my dark brown eyes reflecting nothing but happiness, I knew that my grandmother's faith in the American dream, and in the strength of Armenian women, had been vindicated in the most beautiful way possible. Sometimes the best wedding gift you can give yourself is the courage to demand the respect you deserve. The Davies family gave me a prenup that tried to limit my value. Life gave me something infinitely better, the knowledge that my value was never theirs to determine. And that, more than any business success or financial victory, is the real happy ending to this story.
Anoush's story reveals that true justice comes from reclaiming your worth against prejudice, using strategy and cultural strength to dismantle oppressors. It's a powerful reminder that no one's background defines their destiny. Thank you, Anoush, for your bravery. I'm Eliza Quinn, and remember, here on Wedding Day Justice, veils off, justice on.